welcome to Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades. I'm the host all alone tonight. Representative Gary Hopper, or Gary as they call me. Tonight we have Greg Moore. He is the Grand Flamage of Americans for Prosperity in New Hampshire.
I'm going to put that on my business card.
It's better, isn't it?
I love it.
Yeah, it's wicked good, you know. And I had him on because I wanted somebody to talk about all the stuff that's going on. It's like insane out there.
It's just, you can't even finish one news cycle without 3 or 4 other things jumping on there and like saying, I'm going to crowd that out of the way. So it's pretty impressive.
Because you had the
Georgia special election in South Carolina.
Before that you had, who was testifying? Now see, I've already lost track.
Comey.
No, after Comey.
Jesus.
The Attorney General testified.
Oh, Loretta Lynch?
No, the new.
Oh, Gordon McDonald?
No.
Okay. Jeff Sessions.
Jeff Sessions.
Okay,
nice.
I knew we'd find it eventually.
Eventually. Jeff Sessions testified.
Right.
Did a really great job testifying. And then the ship got hit outside of Japan, and that knocked his testimony off the news cycle. And then you had the shooting of the congressman. Well, a few people got shot. It's just like one thing right after the other.
Absolutely. You have to really buckle up these days. And a lot of the stuff is outside of politics, and there is a fair amount of tragedy, particularly for the 7 sailors who were killed on the destroyer that was hit out in the Sea of Japan.
Right.
2 o'clock in the morning, just most of them were sleeping in their bunks.
That doesn't matter.
And
I am sorry, I don't buy it. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. We were all sleepy. I do feel bad for the 7 sailors. From my understanding, is one reason they died is just trying to shore up the ship and keep it from sinking, which is very, very admirable. But in spite of that, some have theorized that the person at the helm of the container ship was actually Muslim, and it was deliberate.
Well, I'll tell you, they have done just a few, and I know there's going to be an ongoing investigation, and certainly we'll find this out and probably get a little more depth of this. But the understanding that at least in the first 48 hours that came out was that it was the responsibility of the destroyer to give way to the container ship, and the destroyer did not give right of way. I'm not necessarily totally conversant on the rules of the sea. But
right.
My understanding is that the smaller, more agile ship is supposed to give way to the larger ship, which the
Common
container
sense pretty much tells you that anyway.
Yeah, I mean, if you see a ship the size of a container ship, the destroyer obviously is a lot smaller, and I just have to wonder how it happened. I mean, with all the advanced technology we have on these destroyers these days, and on that particular the Aegis class destroyer, which is just completely filled to the gills with technology and electronic hardware.
I don't even know how much a ship like that costs.
They said it's over $1 billion.
So it's $1 billion. It has millions and millions of dollars worth of electronic surveillance equipment. I was told by somebody, very reliable source, that some of their radar type equipment could tell how much change you have in your pocket 2 miles away on a beach.
Right.
Okay? There is no way at all that container ship should have come within, a half a mile of that thing without alarms going off and everything else. So what happened, whether the captain was, I don't know.
Well, the captain was seriously injured. The captain of the ship was
seriously injured.
Was
he
asleep.
Should be seriously
He was
shot.
asleep in his bunk. So now why he was in his bunk? Well, I guess
that's reasonable.
At 2 o'clock in the morning.
But it doesn't matter.
But somebody was on the bridge, and how was that person? How did
there
that
should have been alarms going off everywhere.
Absolutely. So
as soon as that, because it was insane. It is
whether there was a malfunction or whatnot, it shouldn't matter. That the hour of day shouldn't matter, because the surveillance equipment on a ship like that should be able to pick up a gigantic container ship.
Well, not only that, it's not just a surveillance equipment could pick it up. They have multiple layers of surveillance equipment that could have picked it up.
Absolutely. So you have to wonder what happened, what the series of events that took place that allowed this type of tragedy to take place. And It will find out a lot more in probably the coming weeks and months. But certainly it was a major breakdown when a ship with that level of technology gets hit by a ship. It's like the container ship is kind of like, I'm not sure what the equivalent was, kind of like an 18-wheeler. The thing doesn't stop on a dime.
No, yeah,
and
right.
It doesn't turn on a dime either. So
right.
So you have an agile destroyer that's able to avoid missiles coming at it. You'd think it could get out of the way of a container ship.
Exactly. Yeah, that was crazy. I don't, like we say, we don't know yet, but it just, on the face of it, it's not.
Doesn't make sense.
Something is really, really wrong. And then you went to the shooting.
Mm-hmm.
We had the shooting, and that guy,
the House Majority Whip Steve Scalise, who was warming up for the congressional baseball game, which is an annual charity game that takes place at the Washington National Stadium.
Yeah.
And he was just warming up. It was 7:00 in the morning. He was on second base. They were doing some batting practice, and he was doing some fielding practice. And some shooter from Bellsville, Illinois, who had a real axe to grind with anyone relating to Republicans, Donald Trump, conservatism, or anything like that, apparently showed up at the ballpark. In addition to coming up with an M4, he also had a hit list of targeted congressmen. He asked another congressman.
Yeah, wait, he had an M4 and an AR-15.
My understanding is he had an M4.
Because I believe M4 is fully auto.
In this instance, apparently it was not. He was using it in a semi-automatic fashion. There is some video that came out
right.
by just a passerby who was out walking his dog, took some video of it, and it was and one of the first people hit was the Majority Whip. Apparently, in all, there were 5 people hit, including 2 of the security detail of the Majority Whip. Now, if the Majority Whip were not there, his security detail, the Capitol Police, they don't protect every congressman or every senator, but they do protect high-value ones. People like Steve Scalise, who is the number 3 in Republican leadership. Had he not been there with his security detail, because the security detail were able to neutralize and ultimately shoot the shooter in a way that he died from his wounds in the hospital later. But this guy had an axe to grind. He was someone who, on social media, was writing extraordinarily inflammatory things, talking about things like terminating Republicans and killing people who supported Donald Trump, things of that nature. And he's obviously someone who took the rhetoric a little too seriously. And obviously there's a lot of anti-Trump rhetoric out there, and they ratchet it up. Primarily it's ratcheted up for the purposes, you've been around this game for a while, for the purposes of raising money. That's usually why a lot of this rhetoric gets ratcheted up. But there is a certain group of people who take that type of stuff just a little too seriously. He was a retired home inspector and 66 years old. And he just decided that he was going to make it his mission to try to kill as many Republicans as he thought he could. And he showed up at this practice, and just some people out on a Wednesday morning a week ago,
getting ready to do a
charity event to try to help children. And he shot one congressman, one staffer, one lobbyist, and the two members of the security detail.
Now, one of the members of the security detail was actually wounded when they were returning fire, if I'm informed correctly.
Well, both of the security detail were shot, and both will recover. Both of them, I believe, were one was treated and released, and the other one was released the next day. So obviously, the level of severity was not hugely substantial.
Right.
Not so the case for Congressman Scalise, who was hit in the hip, and then the bullet fragmented, and he had a number of serious wounds as a result of it. He was taken to a trauma center where there was emergency surgery that proceeded or that took place after he showed up, and there's been several other surgeries, and he's out of critical condition, but he's still, to the best of my knowledge, in serious condition in that hospital. Is he talking
yet, or do you know?
He is talking. Apparently, he is talking. He is communicative with his family and his staff.
Good.
And I know that the president and the vice president have stopped by his bedside.
There was another fake news. The president went by and stopped by to see him.
Mm-hmm.
And then I forget which news station reported said the president never did that.
Well, it's possible. I suspect that he didn't get a chance to talk to the congressman, because at that point the congressman probably was heavily sedated.
Maybe, yeah.
And
Maybe
so,
went by to see him.
And he might have went by to see him and spoke to his family and such, but didn't
Yeah.
get a chance to actually talk to Steve Scalise, because
Right.
I'm sure at that situation on that first day, it was frankly touch and go for a while. Apparently,
Yeah, it
that he
was.
might actually pass away from the wound.
Yeah,
So.
it's been crazy.
But it's just I think it's certainly up in Concord we've seen some people where they like to ratchet up the rhetoric, and they do that for purposes not necessarily related to policy, more or less to use as a vehicle to raise money for one side will use as a vehicle to raise money against the other. You were there certainly in 2011 when the rhetoric, at least at the state level, reached what strikes me as being an all-time high.
Right. Yeah.
And
At that point, I think Bill O'Brien had everything except horns sticking out of his.
well, he actually did receive death threats.
Yeah.
He actually had to have police protection at points because of the death threats that he had received, and threats against his family as well. And ultimately, I think that it's important to understand that there are an element of people out there who, while the average person will just get a little more energized of it, there are some people who will take that type of stimulus and go over the top and potentially do harm to someone.
Yeah. And I don't have the list in front of me. I should have taken a list. Since the election, the Democrats have tried to subvert the Electoral College. There was some claims, I forget what claims, there was voter fraud.
Right.
They claimed voter fraud. Then they started looking into voter fraud and found out the only fraud was actually against Trump, not for him. So they discontinued that.
Right. They actually made that argument in Pennsylvania and Michigan, and then when they started to do a recount where they started finding more ballots cast in certain precincts in Detroit than there were registered voters in those precincts.
Oh, did you see?
And similar situations in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia where there were more ballots cast than there were voters.
Right.
So that at that point, the groups that asked for the recounts immediately dropped it and said, no, we're going to end our recount. There are, and you know this, Gary. I mean, even here in New Hampshire, we're not, as much as we'd like to consider ourselves, apart from a lot of that the type of the shenanigans that take place.
But
even here in New Hampshire, we see that sometimes too.
I'm trying to get to. So anyway, so they went from that to the voter fraud. Then they went to. Oh well, Hillary blamed it on sexism and everything else. And then it was
racism, sexism,
yeah,
and then Russia.
And Russia. Then they settled on Russia and claimed that there was some great link between Trump and Russia. And Obama apparently started doing...
And Comey. Don't forget Comey.
And Comey.
You left Comey out.
Right. But they had... my understanding is that Obama actually had done surveillance on the Trump team, and there was unmasking of people in his team. And then you continued on this Russian witch hunt, because there's never been really any evidence. As far as I know, there's zero evidence so far, but we still spent 6 months on that. And as soon as Comey came out and basically said there's nothing there, they flipped it to
obstruction of justice.
Right. At what point does this become treasonous?
You know, you raise an interesting...
Because they're trying to subvert the will of the people who duly elected Donald Trump, whether you like him or not, and they're doing whatever they can to subvert it. And the Democrats, like Maxine Waters, have been talking about impeachment since before the guy ever took office.
Right. It's funny. You left one thing out. You left out the popular vote thing, where
the popular vote.
You missed out that one little rhetoric. The point I think that a lot of this just originates from is just the fact that there were a number of people on the left who, in their minds, were convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to win.
Yep.
And they had gotten themselves mentally in a place where they were already considering how a Clinton administration would operate.
And what position
and what positions they would get, what policies she would enact. And instead of actually saying, let's win the election, had moved past that point. And I think what happens is when people have their expectations set and then have the reality doesn't meet those expectations, they try to rationalize them away. And that's part of it. I also think that, to be totally fair, I think that there's a consultant class who don't want to own up to the fact that their poor performance in Hillary Clinton's campaign led to her defeat, and ultimately the inability to accept the results of the election has led to people trying to find excuses to delegitimize President Trump because they don't want to face the fact that maybe they had a really poor candidate, maybe they didn't do the things they needed to do to win effectively, and ultimately the success of Donald Trump is going to have to be constantly in spite of these folks who are constantly trying to delegitimize and denigrate him. But here's the thing that's important to remember. We haven't seen this type of delegitimization of a presidency, in my opinion. Obviously, Barack Obama had his detractors, and yes, there was that little birther thing for a while. And then George W. Bush, there were a lot of people on the left who hated him.
Yeah, because he didn't win the popular vote.
Right. But we haven't seen this type of a delegitimization of a duly elected president, as strangely since Clinton's second term, where as a result of the Lewinsky scandal, there were people who were attempting to, and ultimately did impeach him. The strange thing is if you remember 1998, typically the midterm elections tend to go against the party in power. So the party in power loses seats in those midterm elections. What the constant series of attacks on President Clinton ultimately ended up doing was getting the Democratic base to get so excited that in 1998, going against the grain, the Democrats actually picked up seats, which typically doesn't happen in a midterm generally, and certainly doesn't happen in a second midterm election with the president.
They got their clock cleaned in its first midterm.
Right, but in 1998, the Democrats actually picked up seats in Congress. And what I think a lot of people aren't thinking through is the fact that the ongoing efforts to try to delegitimize President Trump are doing nothing but keeping the conservative base energized. Whereas typically when you have all the controls of power, you have all the wheels of government in your favor, a lot of people tend to be a little less energized because they're getting what you want, right?
Right.
And because of the constant ongoing efforts of the left to try to delegitimize President Trump, I think that we're starting to potentially see a situation where we could be setting ourselves up for an election like 1998, not necessarily with Republicans picking up seats. They still might lose some, but potentially not seeing the type of election go in their favor like 2006, the second midterm under Bush, or the two midterms under Obama. And that's I think a situation that could well play out if they continue to focus on that, because the conservatives see this, and typically instead of being fat and happy, they're getting angry. And I think we saw that. We've seen this in these special elections, particularly in the Georgia election.
Yeah, Georgia
yesterday.
That was crazy because on June 10th, CNN reported that Ossoff had a 7-point lead.
Right.
Okay, 11 days ago, he had a 7-point lead. Mm-hmm. And I think they're manipulating facts, personally. I think they're deliberately trying to, by claiming that the battle's already won, they're trying to basically undermine people's willingness to even go to the polls. Like, why show up if my candidate's already lost?
Right.
And I think if there's any collusion to suppress the vote, it's CNN, MSNBC, and National Propaganda Radio, because they keep publishing these things, and then she won by four points yesterday.
Absolutely, it wasn't anywhere near as close as anybody thought it would be, and I think that's what you're seeing is the fact that the conservative base is not losing any of its energy, and I would submit that it's precisely because by the way, Ossoff radically outspent Handel. She got about less than $5 million from donors. Mm-hmm. He got almost $25 million
dollars
Right.
from donors for his campaign.
The most
And
most money
10%
ever raised by a congressional candidate.
Correct, and only 10% of it was from within the district.
Well, that's not a surprise. He wasn't from within the district.
Right.
Now, if he had lost by one vote, that would have been embarrassing since he didn't live in the district.
So that means over $20 million came from California and New York.
Jersey. They said the zip codes were in California, New York, and strangely enough, Martha's Vineyard.
Martha's Vineyard?
Martha's Vineyard. There's a tremendous amount of fundraising for us up there. But I think that when you start to see the spending so heavily skewed at a time when Trump is supposed to be this anchor on Republicans across the board.
He's supposed to be dragging us down.
He's supposed to be dragging them down. I think what it demonstrates is the fact that the conservative base is not in any way, shape, or form dispirited by some of the things we're seeing in TV. Now, will this continue to hold form for another, the next 13 months or so, 14, 15 months before the 2018 elections,
right?
And both in the primary and in the general. We'll have to wait and see if that continues to happen. Obviously, there's some policy that's going to have a huge impact. The changes to Obamacare. It seems like the Senate's going to come out with a bill, and maybe by the end of this week, I think tomorrow, Thursday, we might see a legislation become public in the Senate to basically repeal and replace Obamacare. The House is working on tax reform right now. Ultimately, those changes in what Donald Trump is able to get done and what Congress is able to get done with these headwinds, with these constant ongoing nagging attacks, these ankle biting attacks, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, people even getting shot, for Christ's sake. The media, back to a little bit to the media. This is a woman who was on Sean Hannity yesterday. I had to write it down because I couldn't possibly remember this. Her name is Camilla Paglia. She was on Sean Hannity. She's a kind of an iconic feminist. Mm-hmm. And her take on this whole thing is, I'm a professor of media studies in addition to a professor of humanities. She says, okay. And I think it's absolutely grotesque the way my party has destroyed journalism. Right now, it is going to take decades to recover from this atrocity that's going on where the news media have turned themselves over to the most childish fraternity, kind of a buffoonish behavior. So one of their, professors or liberal professors is acknowledging that they're lost their minds.
It really is amazing how what we would traditionally describe as more balanced journalistic outlets, and not just the far left groups. Like if MSNBC is attacking Donald Trump, that wouldn't surprise us, right? We knew that was going to happen. If NHPR is attacking Donald Trump, that wouldn't surprise us. But when we start to see news media outlets which tend to have historically tried to pride themselves on their integrity, and they say we're going to keep our news pages fair and balanced, and then on the editorial page we'll kick the crap out of you.
Right. Like the New York Times used to be that way.
Right, and the Washington Post, New York Times, and we've seen them fall for every single allegation made against Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Any allegation that's made against Donald Trump is considered to be true until proven false. And that's not the way journalists are supposed to approach their profession.
Yeah, they should be more of a scientific approach.
An allegation,
skeptical of everything until they
exactly. It's you get an allegation, you don't immediately run to publish or go to Twitter or suggest that something is true, and then force the person who's alleged to have committed this atrocity to deny it.
Right.
And that's unfortunately where we're starting to see too many of the traditional, straightforward journalistic outlets with journalistic integrity. But there are still a lot of outlets out there which work night and day to try to separate fact from fiction. The Wall Street Journal is a great example of that. An organization which says, okay, here's an allegation. let's actually start to look into the facts, and
Right.
let's make you prove the allegation before we try to run out and make news out of it. And I think that it does a disservice, and I think that the quote you mentioned speaks to that. Now the question is, will that damage ever be undone? And the answer is it might not, because of the changing nature of media right now. The changing nature of media right now is shifting radically. It used to be, as you remember, there were 3 TV networks you could watch. There was your local newspaper, and then if you wanted a national news, you'd have to go to the New York Times or something like that, and or get a magazine like Time magazine. The internet has changed everything, changed absolutely everything. Now you can go and where you want to get the coverage and the news that you want. I think it's a little bit unfortunate because people aren't exposing themselves to as much as they used to. But what happens is that people are able to tune out some of this in a way that they haven't in the past. And it might be that the damage that's being done to journalism is never repaired, and that's just what we end up with. Now, keep in mind, though, that everything sometimes is full circle, because when newspapers started back in the early part of our nation's history, they weren't anything that we would describe as fair or balanced.
No, they were pretty brutal.
They were pretty brutal, and you'd have a conservative paper and a liberal paper in town, and you pick which paper you would buy. But that's kind of what we're back to.
Didn't Adams actually make attempts to try to squelch?
He did. I mean, that's part of the reason why if you read a little bit of the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers and discussion over how we get to the Bill of Rights and how we got to the freedom of speech, which includes freedom of the press, people understand that there's a reason why that's in there, and that's because there are people out there who wanted to squelch debate and squelch discussion over political topics, or wanted government to have some control over what could or couldn't be printed. And that is to the credit of our founding fathers, the folks out there like Madison and Hamilton and some of the people who really worked hard to ensure that we have that right going forward.
Do you think some of the problem is you have a few news media? I read this a long time ago. I don't know how true it is. I've never looked into it. A few of the news medias are basically owned by very few people.
There are a lot of conglomerates out there. I mean, when you start to see folks like Jeff Bezos from Amazon buy up Washington Post, and John Henry from one of the Red Sox buys up the Boston Globe. I mean, it almost like there are some conglomerates that own a whole host of properties, and then a bunch of rich guys who are buying them as kind of like a boutique thing.
Right, but if you have a bunch of news media that's owned by a few people and they have an agenda, and to me, and I said this before the election, the biggest thing on the ballot in November wasn't Trump or Hillary, it was globalism versus nationalism. And if they're globalist, which I think is really at the root of a lot of the anxiety, because they want a globalist economy. They want a global economy where America is just a entity on this global network, not the country that it's supposed to be.
Well, I think we see that in debate over the Paris Accord, for example.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The reporting on the Paris Accord, it was the worst thing anybody's ever done in history, and Trump should be drawn and quartered for that too.
There was very little balance in that in a lot of the media coverage, and I think that was Trump's argument that he was making wasn't even presented to people, because his argument was this is about protecting United States sovereignty, and yet all the media outlets never wanted to even give him the opportunity to describe it in those terms, because they know how popular that is among the citizens of the country, and they instead wanted to make it a discussion over environmentalism or whether or not we should shirk our duties as described by the media, as opposed to actually having a conversation about whether or not America should subjugate our policy to extra national organizations, because that's a debate that we should be having.
Exactly, and they did the same thing, and talk about a deal maker, because that's what he said. He says, I'm really good at making deals. to Paris, he was beautiful. Because like you said, it was, look, this deal is really bad for the United States. We're paying out. Nobody else is. We get all these restrictions on the United States as far as
our economy,
coal and everything else. Nobody else does. Says this is just a really, really bad deal for the people of the United States. And that's a great argument. And it was the same thing when he went over talking to the Europeans on NATO. Because he went over there and said he started off the negotiation with, I'm not even sure this organization is really necessary anymore, because he's a negotiator, so he knows where to. By the time he comes back, they've all agreed to start chipping in, which is what he wanted to begin with.
Right.
So it was perfect.
Right.
But that's not how the media played it.
No, the media played it as if America is taking a step back and is embracing sort of a Monroe Doctrine,
right,
isolationism, and I think that as people who are high-end news consumers, folks like you and I who watch a lot of news, we read a lot of news, and so we're exposing ourselves to different outlets and different viewpoints and how people, and we can start to see the shifts from one way to the other. What really concerns me are the people who are the casual news consumers, the people who aren't able to separate the facts from fiction as well.
Election about a week before the election.
Exactly, and those folks
vote.
And those folks, they perhaps don't have the opportunity to understand a little bit some of the bigger picture issues that are being debated. And listen, I get it. I think we all know a lot of people who are just trying to raise their kids and getting their kids to basketball or karate or something like that.
Working overtime.
Absolutely. And I don't blame them for not spending hours a day reading through every single newspaper and media outlet possible. It's not realistic to expect that everyone can, because life happens.
Yeah.
But for someone who just picks up the paper maybe once a couple times a week, doesn't get a chance to read through it all, you wonder how much of that stuff sticks and how much of that stuff is just sort of washed away.
But I just wonder if you have these basically conglomerates of news. One thing they did today, and is what they use for words is really, really important. You'll see the actual terminology they use in reports change. Today I saw another one. There was the police officer who was stabbed in the neck. They said that. I'm willing to bet the guy tried to slit his throat. Mm-hmm. Okay? And they said the FBI is not sure if this is a terrorist attack, but the people witnesses, and this is how they phrased it, he said praise to God in Arabic. Mm-hmm. Now, what I am positive he said, I don't know, I haven't heard a video or anything, is Ali Akbar. Okay, but they didn't report it like that because it's, they're trying to be politically correct.
And ultimately we see it in numerous instances where the AP style guide says that they're no longer illegal aliens and now undocumented immigrants.
Right, exactly.
Which is often frequently absurd. Most of them have plenty of documentation. It's just factually inaccurate. But that's the way of sort of desensitizing. You ever listen to the skit by George Carlin about language and how language is constantly being desensitized?
The F-bombs and stuff?
Well, not the one about the seven words you can't say, but he made a great point about how, for example, he used a term, how they went from shell shock through like combat fatigue until post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
And so the word shell shock was perfect because it actually described the condition that people were.
Yeah, they came back from combat and they were just.
And now he said we've got it up to 8 syllables now, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
And ultimately we're undermining the value of language when we try to desensitize it. And I think that's one of those cases where a lot of the folks on the left have really done a lot of work in terms of really putting a lot of focus on political correctness as a way of making sure that their point is made. So the point you'll often hear from a lot of folks for example, Paris Accord, they'll say global warming is settled science. Well, it's not. First of all, if you're a scientist, there's no such thing as settled science.
Right.
And secondly, it's not settled science, or even close to it. There's a healthy debate going on. They just don't want you to hear about it.
Yeah, Newtonian physics was settled science until
it wasn't.
Einstein.
Exactly.
And then it wasn't settled science.
And then it wasn't. and so you're really doing a disservice to the reader or the viewer or the listener when you start using these code words or buzzwords. Actually, there was when I was working at the Department of Health and Human Services as a director a decade ago, we had anti-hunger programs. So we focused on how do we actually improve the lives of people who are actually starving, people in poverty who are starving.
Yeah.
There's programs like food stamps and WIC. And now President Obama massively blew out eligibility, blew out eligibility of people more than double the federal poverty level and now being able to get food stamps. But they couldn't call it anti-hunger anymore because a lot of those people who are getting them now aren't hungry. They can buy their own food.
Right.
But they changed it to food insecurity.
Right.
It's now food insecurity, which if you read it, the definition of food insecurity is people who are concerned about not having access to nutritious meals, which is they've gone from an actual physical condition, hunger, to now a mental state, being concerned about I might not be able to get a nutritious meal. So now they get to define what nutritious is.
Right. Now they did the same thing with healthcare.
Yep.
Healthcare was something people work for, or you got a job that had insurance, and now it's a constitutional right if you listen to the left.
Well, it's not just that. It's if you listen to it, they use the word health insurance when they mean health care. They say you don't have access to health care. That's not true. If you go to a hospital and you're bleeding, they'll take you.
Yeah.
So you do have access to health care. What they mean is you don't have somebody paying for that paying that doctor for that treatment.
Correct.
But they use the term don't have access to health care and completely in a way that's factually inaccurate.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But my overall point was that because you have all these conglomerates who are, in my understanding, globalists, and they keep trying to sway the voters through the different news outlets. I just wonder if it's going to reach a point where they're just, I think it's already reached the point where they're not even taking that seriously anymore.
Right.
As you might remember, I supported Cruz for president.
Mm-hmm.
I am so glad I was wrong, because Trump is the only one that has the star power and the tenacity to get back against the news media.
Well,
he's been awesome.
I think that his strategy from the beginning, as we know, I know everybody who's in the inside of Washington, one of the first things they always say, take the Twitter account away from Trump. Take it away from him, right?
Yeah.
You hear it, everybody in Washington says that.
They all
right?
say that.
They all say that uniformly. Take the Twitter account away from him. But that's because he can't be controlled, and he can go over the top he's got this medium that he's using that's allowing him to go over the top of the news media and go directly to the public and have a conversation with them without using the filter of the news media.
Which is awesome.
Which drives the news media and the other people in Washington who say these are the rules, you play by the rules.
Yes.
And it's driving them completely crazy.
That's actually, I think, one of the cool things, results of the election yesterday, is I think secretly there were a lot of Republicans in Washington, D.C. that hoped Ossoff was going to win. Because they don't like that. They like somebody that's controllable. And yesterday's election basically said people aren't that upset. So they're still,
or people are upset on both sides.
Oh, I think that's true.
And if you were to listen to the news media, that your perception is that the only people who are upset are the folks on the left.
Right.
They're protesting, they're rallying, they're having all these events, they're wearing the little pink hats and doing all the other things. But what they don't realize, or they can't ignore, is the fact that the folks on the right haven't stopped being upset and being engaged.
Right.
And that really is, I think, an important distinction, that the media has to cover that angle now. They can't continue to ignore it.
We're going to run out of time before we. The big event tomorrow up at the State House is, maybe the ladies will show up dressed in, what are they called? What are the costumes?
Handmaids.
The handmaids will show up. That'll be entertaining.
Well, if we're going to do live action role playing up in the State House, I'm hoping that someone shows up in like a knight armor, wear like
knights in shining armor.
Yeah, wear like a mail and bring a sword. I think that'd be great.
I think that'd be awesome.
I think if we're gonna do a live action role playing, we should go all in.
Yeah, we should just have like a play going on in the balcony every
Absolutely.
week.
Absolutely. As long as they keep it down and let you guys debate, right?
Right. Well, at least it'll give you something to pay attention to.
Right.
What the heck?
The state budget is a big issue.
State budget is the big issue tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
What's or is this a position? Does Americans for Prosperity take a position on the budget?
Well, all in all, particularly looking at the trailer bill, there's a lot we really like about the trailer bill.
Okay.
The budget, we think, spends more than we...
Explain what a trailer bill is.
So, for those folks who actually care about the mechanics of state budgeting, which is about maybe one person watching TV right now, there's actually two pieces of legislation. One piece of legislation has...
take a nap while you go through.
Yeah, one piece of legislation has all little line items where how much this program gets and how much that program gets. And the other one has changes in statutory law that allow that budget to work.
Right.
And the changes in state law is called a trailer bill. It's a long story. We could explain it, but that bill right there has a lot of positives in it. It reduces taxes on employers, which follows successful efforts to do that 2 years ago. It actually eliminates electricity consumption tax, which will help lower electricity bills for...
It's not much, though.
It's not a huge amount. It's only going to be probably like 30 cents a month, which is... I'll take my 30 cents, thank you very much.
It's better that way than the other way.
Absolutely. It puts work requirements on those individuals who are receiving Medicaid expansion benefits. So it says if you're an able-bodied adult who's getting free health care paid for by the taxpayers, and there's an obligation for you to go to go get work. It really expands charter schools, which I think is beneficial long term, to give parents opportunities to find the best place for their kid. Ideally, the budget spends more than we would prefer, but on balance, it's a positive, and we think that on the whole, we're hopeful that it's able to move forward tomorrow, and we're able to get moving on a number of these policy initiatives, and then really hopeful that Governor Sununu then takes that budget and really starts to work with his department heads to try to find places to cut spending.
Right.
And we talk about the legislative piece, but the executive branch makes a big difference too.
Well, actually, it's funny you should say that. I was talking to Representative Lynn Ober yesterday because I kept getting phone calls from state employees and saying you're cutting my benefits or something. And I didn't know what, so I sat down with her, asked her what are they specifically referring to, and what it was is that the budget had only paid a certain amount for state employees, and then they had to cover whatever that came up short. So they were always supposed to pay a certain percentage. The problem was under Lynch, he had a slush fund that he kept filling that gap with.
Right.
And I believe Maggie Hassan did the same thing, which to me is a misappropriation of funds. And so they're not used to actually paying a percentage of the amount for their health care.
Right.
And that's why they're upset. Now, teachers like in Manchester, when they retire, they don't get health care.
No.
I don't know anybody that gets health care after they're retired.
The state retiree health benefit is very generous. It's very expensive, and it's not something that's mandated in the state constitution like the state pension is.
Right.
So the legislature has the ability to control it, and its costs have gone through the roof, and ultimately that's one of those things where there needs to be some cost sharing, because one of the things we know about in healthcare is that if you give someone an unlimited benefit, they'll just keep using more and more of it. But if they actually have some skin in the game, they'll think twice as to, do I really need that?
I look at it this way. If I could pay $100 a month, or if my employer paid for $100 a month, and I would not have to pay for any repairs to my automobile. Okay, John Heichel anytime there's a problem, I just bring it in there.
What about your motorcycle? That too?
I'm pretty sensitive about my motorcycle.
Okay.
We don't want to go over there.
Okay.
John, I would just bring it into John Heichel, and he would fix it, regardless of the cost.
Mm-hmm.
Would I even care if I got an oil change?
No.
Why?
Well,
so they have to replace the engine. What do I give it?
Right. Exactly. So, I think we've seen it in a number of healthcare plans, like health savings accounts. When people have some skin in the game, they become much better healthcare shoppers.
Yeah.
And I think that doing that for the retirees is an important thing. But I think it's an important thing to remember as far as a lot of these state agencies have not been having a chief executive in the last few years, in the last dozen years. They haven't had a chief executive that said, look, I expect you to be careful how you manage your budget. Right. I expect you to really be focused on delivering the best value for the taxpayers going. And they haven't had that message coming from the corner office. Certainly with this budget, maybe it spends a little more than we'd like, but hopefully it gives Governor Sununu the tools to start to rein in spending within those agencies.
Now, see, I don't. The spending is basically 2% per year.
Well, see, but one of the challenges is that the legislature this past year spent money like drunken sailors because we have a substantial revenue surplus.
Right.
So we spent in between budgets in this fiscal year $144 million that more than was budgeted.
Right.
And that has dramatically increased the baseline. And then they're saying, well, the spending is only a little bit more. Yeah, but only because you spent money
that you didn't have.
You did have it, but we're in a boom economy.
Right.
We're in a boom economy. This isn't going to last forever.
Right.
At some point, and you remember the 2011-2012 budget, at some point the economy is going to cool off and you have to pay the piper.
Right.
And it's best in times of boom economies. Number one, if you're going to spend anything, it should only be a one-time expense. But that one-time expense shouldn't be considered against the next year, right?
Correct. Yeah, it shouldn't be part of the quote-unquote default budget.
Right. It shouldn't be part of the growth for the next year. Or you should find ways to either sock that money away, or I know it sounds crazy, give it back to the taxpayer.
Whoa!
I know.
Whoa, Greg.
I know. This is.
I think that's hate speech, but
I know. It depends on the person you ask, but ultimately, I know. So if you look at the last budget that was passed and look at the current budget as proposed, the growth in the general fund budget to budget is a little over 9%. Just in the general fund. You add in the education trust fund, it's down around 6%.
Right.
But that is something that a lot of fiscal conservatives are concerned about, largely because a lot of them have been you included, have been voting against a lot of these special bills that have been coming through the House.
Yeah.
It's to spend new money here, spend new money there, and it's fine. And it's fine for maybe a little bit if there's a real crisis. But when they're saying let's give a $2 million bailout to dairy farmers,
right, right.
I mean, those are the types of situations where you have to ask yourself, we're going to help one industry. Not only is it costing taxpayer money, but it's also setting a bad precedent.
It's also bordering on unconstitutional. Article 10 of the New Hampshire Constitution.
Absolutely. And fundamentally, when you have these types of situations, but then you say, okay, well, we're going to use all that spending as part of the baseline for the next budget. It's hard to make the argument that we're keeping it under inflation.
Right.
So I think that the conservatives do have a solid, valid point, but on balance, the budget is still a good one, and certainly we hope to see it pass tomorrow.
Yeah, I think it's spent a lot more money on the opioid crisis and stuff like that. I think there's 60% increase on spending for that.
In a number of different areas, there's a lot of new spending in a number of areas, and fundamentally.
Oh, we got to leave in a second.
So,
Greg got me a hand grenade too. He brought in hand grenades for me.
It's important to have just in case.
You can't have enough hand grenades. That's just my belief. So.
And the good news is it doubles as a stress ball.
It does. I'm gonna carry this with me tomorrow.
You might need it.
I'm gonna definitely need it because there's gonna be amendments and more amendments.
Particularly, just hope the handmaidens aren't throwing hand grenades.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm a little bit out of reach for them.
Okay.
Luckily.
Okay.
I'm over the end of I'm over in section 5, so I'm probably safe.
Well, they might have a good arm. You never know.
I doubt it.
Okay.
I doubt it. Those costumes they wear are pretty restrictive.
Okay.
I think,
Okay, you're probably safe.
Yeah, I'm probably safe. So I had a question. This is probably a little bit too deep for you.
Probably.
But remember, well, you're younger than me, but I grew up on movies about war movies, right? And it was all the time they'd get in a really tough situation, and they'd say "fire at will,"
Right.
right? How would you know which one's named Will?
Well, I think you just
Do they
just
have
have
name
to.
tags?
You
I
have
mean,
to.
they'd have to have like a name tag about that big.
Right.
Hey, I'm Will. Shoot at me.
Exactly. I mean, there's no question that Will was going to get the lion's share. If I were named Will, I wouldn't want to be in a war.
No, I would.
I'd want to be way in the back of the quartermasters.
Right. I know. It's just ridiculous that they would single.
I might go for Bill. I might go.
Bill. Yeah.
Yeah, I go with
Bill.
Bill.
Anything else but Will. Will is just a stupid name to have in the combat. But Greg, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
We'll see you guys next week.